All right, what is going on, comrades? This is the Parallax Viewer with your host, the Big Signorelli, aka the Big Sig, Siggy Stardust, or you could just call me Andrew. I'm really excited to launch this project right here. I've been formulating this project since the end of 2024, and it was my goal to start it as early as January of 2025, but of course, due to time, wage labor, other external factors of the reality principle, and my own pleasure principle. We're now doing it at March, because I originally also was gonna be like, okay, plan B, February, but stuff comes up, other projects have been coming up. Needless to say, this is the first installment of the seminars of Jacques Lacan, seminar 16, from an other to the other. And as you can see, I've been putting a dent in this thing since it first came out back in what was it? The end of 2023, beginning of 2024. And what really inspired me to do this project was just how, you know, important this seminar is in understanding not only psychoanalysis as a clinical practice, but as a discourse that analyzes not only, you know, the unconscious structure like a language, but how it relates to civilization, its discontent, and how we could incorporate a Marxist analysis alongside psychoanalysis. And Marxism plays a pivotal role, also through a critical lens, which Lacan will be very critical of. If you have been keeping up with both the Vanishing Mediators channel, the cartel for the seminars of Jacques Lacan, and my personal channel, or the Parallax Viewer as it's retitled now, uh, we had a conversation with Comrade Daniel Tutt regarding his essay inspired by this seminar. And as you know, I had participated in his seminar study group on Seminar 16, and I'm currently in his study groups for the Seminar 17 um, reading group. And also, I have participated in his Paris manuscripts of 1844, the Lacerda study groups, and currently doing the Althusser group. So, a lot of great ideas around Marxism and psychoanalysis, and it has propelled me to do my own project in exegesis and even future writings that will be inspired from what I've learned throughout the course of studying this seminar and all the dialogues that I have been engaging with Daniel and co, and even with another fellow comrade who has been on the Vanished Mediators channel, Paris Levitas. You might have seen the uh, episode where we were talking about the signifier, structures the realist, mathematics, logic, all this inspired by not only Little D and later Lacanian seminars, but also a pivotal point from, you know, the Seminar 16 uh, readings and juxtaposing it from the early readings that we were tearing with. So, with that being said, I'm really happy to get into this project. So, um, let's get into it. So, I mean, to give a quick historical background of it, and I'm not as good as, like, let's say, Comrade Daniel in explaining a lot of this stuff. So, I'll just give you a snippet of it. This is taking place right around the aftermath of the famous May 68 protest, which was a failure, right? Um, and like prior to like the official publication of the seminar, most of the people, like including Lacanians, thought like Lacan was very cynical, anti-worker, anti-leftist movements. Now, regardless of his personal affiliation, in regards to politics, whether one wants to call him a liberal or a moderate or centrist or conservative, choose your ad hominems. Uh, you will get a different understanding of Lacan's relationship to not only the student movement, but also his tearing with Marxism, and how Marxism, like I said earlier, is one of a lot of Marxists, but like Marx is an interlocutor, and Lacan, you could say, is becoming a reader of Marx. The French philosopher um, Jacques Jean-Claude Milner wrote a text called the Clear Oeuvre, trying to outline a theoretical trajectory regarding Lacan's thought and how it shifts from the early seminars um, to the later seminars, and juxtaposing these notions of exoteric readings and esoteric readings, meaning what's the difference between the écrits and the seminars. Uh, he says that there is a point in Lacan's seminar years where he is in his sort of Marxist shift, and it is from, I guess you could say, seminar 16 all the way to seminar 20-ish, 21. And then once we get into like the non-dupe airs and even the Joycean stage, this is where we kind of lose the Marxist inspiration in the reading of Marx that Lacan was playing off of. So another thing to kind of point out regarding this time is that another influential thinker that Lacan will kind of, play off of, but also has his own distance for whatever reason, even though this thinker looked highly up to Lacan, would be the one and only Louis Althusser. Because you got to remember, right after the instantiation of the Names of the Father seminar, which was never finished, he is kicked out of the IPA. And so, where is he invited to host the rest of his seminars, at least up until now, would be with the Althusserians. Louis Althusser opens up his door to Lacan, and Lacan will host a majority of these seminars up until I think around this time. Um, and so that's literally like all I'm going to say for now because my uh, sort of concept of the historicity or the historicization of, you know, what's going on in the background of the seminar is not that good, and my memory is kind of fogging. And I'm more focused on what theoretical gems we could find in the text, maybe later in these exegetical readings, or maybe in some writing. I'll talk about more of the historical background and some of the, um, you know, also events or conditions within May 68. But until then, we're going to get into this text. So, yeah. With that being said, um, so what is psychoanalysis? This is our first question. What is psychoanalysis? Well, Lacan puts on the blackboard, it is a discourse without speech, or parole, if you like your French terms. But wait, hasn't Lacan put so much emphasis on speech and language? Isn't he contradicting himself? Well, we'll get to that soon. In the meantime, this is what has been written on the blackboard, as I've just said. Psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech. So we could already get the hint that Lacan, and again, if you are just watching this for the first time, this is your first time on the channel, you don't even know about the Vanishing Mediators channel, I'll put links to that below. Um, these will this channel will go over a lot of the early seminars, one, two, and three, and you'll get an idea of what Lacan is doing. But it's safe to say even back then he's doing this, but right now he is getting at the fact that there is a difference between a discourse and speech. So we'll highlight that, right? That psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech, meaning that there can be a discourse where speech is not involved, right? So sit with that for a moment as I sit my PBR. And by the way, I also found out that Freud loved PBRs, so we're gonna take another shot at that. Anyhow, let's get back to this. Let's get back to this, John. So Psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech, but that doesn't really say anything, right? At least for right now. But I will be quite blunt and tell you what it is not. What psychoanalysis is definitely not is structuralism. But unfortunately for these Parisian journalists around the heat of May 68 and a lot of the intellectuals that were involved, they unfortunately get dumped and lumped into a neat pile and thrown into a trash bin, thrown into the rubbish under the banner of structuralism. And sadly, Lacan is dumped into there. And he makes his own jokes regarding the way that the journalism, the hegemony of the university finds it easy to lump all these intellectuals that stick out as a sore thumb and put them under a banner. And it's quite funny because we use this term nonchalantly, structuralism, to talk about, and again, Lacan, Althusser, which I will say Lacan and Althusser are not structuralists. I think I mean, look, we'll get to Lacan and what differentiates him from this term structuralism, but my in my reading of Althusser, I would not even call him a structuralist in the way that, like, again, other people were in this banner. Claude Lévi-Strauss, Marcel Mauss. You get people like Roland Barthes, right? And then I think people like Foucault get put in this banner, Derrida. And then it's funny thinking about how this is happening in this time. And then you fast forward today, not only is this term structuralism used to encapsulate all these French thinkers, but then you also have post-structuralism or postmodernism to encapsulate all these thinkers in, quite frankly, in a derogatory way, especially the Anglophone world, all the charlatans, as uh, Chomsky would like to say, all these cults of personalities in the French scene. Or Jordan Peterson bro will say that, oh, they're a bunch of postmodern neo-Marxists and he's probably never read a single text from Foucault or Derrida in his life. But I just find it funny that like something like that is happening back then and it's used as a sort of slogan, which has a sort of negative connotation, or it's used as a derogatory term. And we still see that today. And not to say that everybody uses it, some of it just we'll just say that just to lump a certain um, mode of thought that happened at a historical point in time. But Lacan is obviously showing that these journalists who are just voices of the university, lumping them together and putting them in the trash can. And he makes this sort of play on words and neologism with French, saying that, like, it's not a publication, it's like a publication. It's like a mixture of the French term for trash or rubbish and publication. And he calls it publication or rublication. Um, we are literally tossed and flushed away as shit, right? We are what the university and the hegemony does not want, and we are tossed out into the street or we're flushed down the toilet. We are literally in the shit of discourse. um, and so, yeah, we are all in some real shit. It's not to say that structuralism as a term is trash. I mean, let's be honest. As I said, there are some great works coming out of people like Claude Lévi-Strauss, Marcel Mauss, and of course, like Lacan is definitely indebted to some of these thinkers, right? But he also kind of does say what, people who are likened under this banner of structuralism that deal with structure, they have a seriousness to them, But if we're thinking about like Levi Strauss and Marcel Mauss, they are anthropologists. And Lacan is not doing an anthropology, let alone he is not doing a philosophical anthropology, as he states. Because a philosophical anthropology starts out from a presupposition of man, right? Man having an essence, man having something that we start with that is apodictic. Um, Maybe one could argue that not all philosophical anthropologies are like this, but it seems like Lacan is really advocating for this. Now, before we continue, most of the lectures that I plan to do um, will not be the same. I will bounce from writing a sort of summary and exegesis, so that way I keep the flow going. It's more exciting. Then other times I will read through the text, not all of it, but some of the important elements. And I think for this one, just as an intro, because I will only be dealing with the introductory seminar chapter, that I will actually share my screen and show the seminar and only flip through some of the important parts. All right. So grab your beer and grab your seminar and let's get into this because right now we are going to get into this text right now. So you can see my screen, good. And if my screen is not being shared, well, goddamn, we are fucked then. So here we are, right? As he says, structuralism can only be identified, or so it seems to me, at least with something that I will quite simply call seriousness. So as I said, there is some seriousness to it. And this isn't the first page. This, as you can see, this is the fourth page. But what I said pretty much in the intro is pretty much in the first few pages. So I think I'm gonna show because this is the most important part right here. It's leading up to what I had stopped at that we're not dealing with a worldview, right? And we could say, even though structuralism wants to find some elementary structures or like some elements that are fundamental to any given society or any given conjuncture or structure, this is not what Lacan is doing. And we shouldn't put psychoanalysis into the same um, umbrella as philosophy or what structuralism is trying to do as a social science or something like that. But science will be something that is important, and we will get to that later. And right here, as he's saying right here, uh, if as a psychoanalyst, I had tried in any way to introduce what is ridiculously called a psychoanalytic anthropology, it would suffice in order for me to refute, in order for you to refute me, to recall at the very threshold of what the domain, the constitutive truths of psychoanalysis brings with it. They concern man, or sorry, uh, they concern those that Genesis tells us God created, man and woman. Although one also finds God created him instead of or Dieu le, my French is bad. Dieu le crée instead of Dieu les crée. God only knows why. Psychoanalysis tells us that there is no union of man and woman. All right, that is going to be important. Without castration determining at level of fantasy the reality of the female partner of whom castration is impossible, and without castration playing its part, um, in the sort of concealment or receiving or possessing of stolen goods. Um, so I think it's important to really digest this right here. Um, that posits castration as the truth in the male partner to whom it is spared in reality, except in cases where things accidentally go too far. The impossibility of carrying out castration comes to be posited as determining her reality, whereas the worst possible thing castration threatens him with has no need to occur to be true, in the sense in which the term leaves one no recourse. This reminder alone implies that, at least in the field that appears to be our own, to be ours, there is no harmony, no matter how we designate it. Owing to this, we must obviously ask ourselves what sort of discourse can suit this field. Will we have to raise here the question with which all of philosophy begins compared to so many other fields of knowledge? And he uses the term savoir. which will be important later on as well. I'm just saying that a lot of things are going to be important, but some keynotes, the term savoir will come up, um, which are lacking in neither value nor efficacy. What would make this discourse, which is self-grounded on the basis of, move my screen, of a criterion that of thought appropriately gauges deserves to be called episteme or science. So one of the things that we have to understand, right, before I continue reading, um, is that psychoanalysis again is not dealing with presuppositions in philosophy. What we're dealing with is something related to the discourse of science. And so in Freud's time, Freud asked, you know, could psychoanalysis be a science, right? And for Lacan, he reformulates this because he doesn't think that it is a science, right? And I think for Milner, as he says in his text, that for Freud, he is, even though he created something revolutionary, what inhibited him from furthering out the discourse of psychoanalysis was that he was caught in the ideals of science and also trying to formulate what an ideal science would be like. And if I understand him correctly, it's that it's like there's this dialectic with it. It's like the ideals of science still wrestle with the fact that what is unconscious is an ideal science, right? Or this core doctrine, which relates back to its sort of mystical kernel, that it has not in no way divorced itself from superstition and becomes reified in its own way. And Lacan, of course, is critical of philosophy, but in a way, he is critical, but also finds importance in science as much as Freud did. And this discourse of science, this is why he thinks that science really paves the way for the groundworks of psychoanalysis because of the introduction of energetics. And of course, we're dealing with an energetic reality, but what comes with that is a model, a sort of formalism based off mathematics that also introduces a formalization, a discourse. So it's not enough that we have symbols that represent certain things that we are trying to talk about in a certain reality, but that this reality is also created off of the formalism that becomes a formalization. Physics is like this, right? Physics, although part of the, for lack of a better term, ideology of science is that it thinks that it is engaged with empirical reality, in fact, is dealing with its model, which creates its own reality of nature, and then creates a sort of formalism or formalization of it with mathematics. And Lacan will say later that it's like discourse really has no effect on nature. Nature itself is indifferent. What we do is, in fact, create an effect on, um, you know, the discourse, right? The model, uh, nature as a term created by the signifiers within a discourse. And this becomes important because discourse for Lacan is something without speech, because what we're engaging, thanks to, science engaging with mathematics, there's also a point where and he draws from the analytic philosophers. Um, Certain analytic philosophers marry back the relationship with logic and mathematics and mathematical logic. So once we deal with formalism and formalization, we're also dealing with the mathematical logic. And because of this, we run into impasses, contradictions, paradoxes. He's been talking about this for the longest. Set theory becomes important in this regard. And he sees the unconscious similar to that. Because the unconscious is a discourse that is structured like a language, but it is not speech, right? It is actually sort of what, cannot be said or is only half said. Um, it's within the gaps of speech, which it seems like it's different because if we look at Seminar One, he's talking about speech all the time, right? And he says that like, when we're talking about psychoanalysis, it's not just two bodies in the session. We have to account for the third, which is speech, which is language. And there's a symbolic component to it, of course. But it's only to account for something that is built in with that differential network. It's the unconscious that is structured like a language, but it is not a language. All right. So I just want to build that up and not get too lost in the sauce right now. Um, so science again becomes important throughout this whole seminar. In the attempt to bring thought into tune with itself, we are encouraged to be more prudent, if only first of all through the challenge I have just sketched out. Truth's challenge to reality. The notion of the unconscious confronts us with the rule, the yardstick of thought that must be grounded on the basis of non-thought, as something that could be its cause. It is only to the extent that statements lie outside of the meaning and not on the basis of their meaning, as people think and all of phenomenology assumes that I am qua thought, right? So right here, there's a distinction between thinking and being, right? Or even as he'll say, I forget where exactly, being in existence, right? And this has to do with the signifier and his rendition of the cogita ergo sum in light of Freud's saying, where it was, ego will be, or where it was, I will be, I will find myself. Lacan says, like, when I'm thinking, I am not. And when I am not thinking, um, where I'm not thinking, I will be, right? So the distinction between Descartes and Lacan is that for Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The truth is, I think, and therefore I am being. I am existing. And for philosophers, existence is synonymous with being. But for Lacan, due to the signifier, you don't have to, um, you know, exist to be, right? You could be dead, and your name, its signifier, and the signification that comes with that, for lack of a better term. We're talking about Lacan right now. Lacan is not alive, but this signifier still persists. The signifier has its sort of being, without his existence, right? And of course, if you have paid attention to the Seminar 3 series, we've talked about how Lacan's notion of the signifier is one without a referent, right? But we'll get into that. I just wanted to let y'all, you know, peep the technique real quick that Lacan is laying out for us. My thought is not adjustable at will, whether we add word, alas, or not. It is regulated when I take action. I do not try to express it, but rather to cause it. Yet it is uh, discourse, not action, that is at stake here. In discourse, I need not follow its rule, but instead find its cause. Thought's being is found in between meaning, between senses, and perhaps the direction in which one enters. You can hear that as obscenely as you like. That which serves as thought's cause because it goes through my mind purely and simply allows what was qua being to go through. This is owing to the fact that where it came from, it has already and always passed through producing thought effects. It's raining is a thought event whenever it is enunciated. And its subject is first and foremost it, this hele, meaning helium, but pronounced in French just like il, um, ile, I think is how it's pronounced. I would say that constitutes in a certain number of significations, which is why this il, is comfortably found anew in everything that follows. It's raining can, for example, be followed by first truths or it's too much. Above all, if we confound rain qua meteor and aqua pluvia, rainwater, the water one collects, the meteor lends itself to a metaphor. Why? Because it already is made up of signifiers. Quote, it is raining, end quote. The being of thought is the cause of a thought insofar as it is outside of meaning. It was already and always the being of a prior thought. Now, making use of this structure renders impossible the tuning of any sort of infallibility. It relies on the crack, uh, he says, or failure, phile, alone, or rather on how it proceeds, develops. There is indeed a cracking process, developing of the failure, process de la phile. Again, my French is not good. And it is the process of which making use of structure relies. But it can only rely on it by following it, which is in no wise to go beyond it. Unless this allows it to be grasped in the consequence that is set in the stone of the very point at which the consequence that, uh, unless this allows it to be grasped in the consequence that is set in stone at the very point at which the repeating of the process stops, which implies that it is an interruption that determines the result. This I would add discreetly in passing, explaining why all art is defective. It derives its power from collecting what is hollowed out. At this point, at which its failures, its breakdowns, defiances occurs. This is why music and architecture are the supreme arts. I'm using the word supreme here in the technical sense, as the maximum at the basal level, producing the relation between the harmonic number and time and space, from the vantage point of their incompatibility. Indeed, as we now know, the harmonic number is no more than a sieve. It retains neither one nor the other, neither time nor space. This is what structuralism takes seriously. It takes qua, it takes knowledge qua cause seriously. Cause in thought with most often, it must be said, a delusional aim. Don't be scared. These are introductory comments, reminders of certainties, not truths. Today, before presenting the schema with which I intended to begin, I would like to mention that if there is already something you can hold on to, it is what I took the trouble to write out on the board earlier. The essence of psychoanalytic theory is a discourse without speech. This is the essence of the theory. The essence of psychoanalytic theory is the function of a discourse, specifically insofar as, and this may strike you as a new or at least paradoxical, I say that it is without speech. What is the status of a theory in the psychoanalytic field? On this point, I hear strange echoes around me. Misunderstanding abounds. Um, by pausing a whole field of thought as involving manipulation, I seem to be calling traditional principles into question. And this leads people to translate what I am saying as some such nonsense, as theoretical impossibility, which is especially surprising in that this is done in nearby place and by people who are close to me. One day I stated in the context that made what I meant quite clear that, quote, there's no such thing as a universe of discourse, end quote. And this was in seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy. This apparently led some to shortly, therefore, to conclude, then why bother? Yet my statement was not at the least bit ambiguous. Um, it is hard to see the fact that one can state, which I did, that discourse has no point of closure, can lead people to conclude that discourse is impossible or even slightly devalued thereby. Far from it, which is precisely why this discourse is in your hands. You have a responsibility to direct it well, taking into account what the statement that there's no such thing as a universe of discourse means. There is thus, in this regard, nothing for me to correct. I must simply return to it to take the following steps by laying out the consequence of this discourse I have already delineated. I will perhaps also have to return to what makes it such that, despite being as attached as an analyst may be, the conditions of this discourse, one can thus show where it breaks down at any moment before returning to this. Allow me a bit of music. Let's play the music. So let's break that down. So he is recalling something that he states in the beginning of Seminar 14, as I said, on the logic of fantasy. And apparently, there are critics of this statement because they're taking it out of context. But what does he mean by that? So, in the beginning of that seminar, he talks about discourse, and this statement, there is no such thing as a universe of discourse, meaning that there is no closed, contained whole of discourse where something can be the container for all sets of discourses. If you're catching my drift, we are talking about the Russell's paradox, or we are using the Russell set to show that there is no discourse that can account for all discourses that do not represent themselves. So if you have a discourse, let's say, you know, a type of science, a type of social science, it can only, and again, not just the science, not just the mathematics, not just a philosophy, but insofar that it becomes a discourse, something that is formalized, not just a formalism, but something that maintains a signification, which can be talked about, written about, challenged, debated, exchanging of signs, right? Well, it is not a contained whole in itself. You know, it must relate itself to other discourses which do not represent purely themselves, right? And ultimately, each discourse is not a contained whole because it relies on a certain formalization to relate its meaning to other things. And he likens this again to sets, and we could obviously say signifiers, right? Because this goes back to, again, signifier um, in the Saussurian sense, right? We're talking about this the sign as a signifier and signified. But Lacan says that for the signifier, and including discourse, um, that signifiers get their meaning from other signifiers, right? And so, if we're talking about discourse, if we're talking about something that is on the process of formalization, right, it relies on its meaning from another set of discourses, right? And so, all of knowledge has tried to been totalizing, right? To encapsulate, to have that one discourse be the final one, the big toe, the theory of everything, to encapsulate it, right? Just like for Russell to critique Frege, that set, which would contain all sets that do not contain themselves. Because what was a set? Well, set is just something that's mathematically abstract. It's just a formalism to say it's just like it could be anything, right? Instead of saying set, we could just say it's like a box that could have anything. It could have toys, it could have socks, it can have books. And or since we're mathematicians, quote unquote, numbers, right? So you got like a one, two, three, four, five, six, and that's your set. And that could be a closed set. But then it could keep going, right? And then does it ever get closed? Well, then we would have to have something contain it, but also at the same time be able to let me slow down. These sets, right? They contain members that don't contain themselves, right? Therefore, they're a part of that set. So then we could switch from having sets with members with sets that don't contain themselves. So to dumb it down, it's like I talked about the box. All right. Now, what if we put a box upon a box upon a box upon a box? Well, then we would need a box to contain all boxes that do not contain themselves. Because if I have a box right there or a container, those don't contain themselves. A box doesn't contain itself, or a trash can doesn't contain itself. A trash can contains trash, and trash doesn't contain itself, whether it's cans and whatever. It needs to be contained by a can. So then, do we have uh, uh, a can for all cans that do not contain themselves, right? So then we run into this problem of just like what would be the last trash can. And it's kind of funny I'm talking about trash cans, not to be Jaques, but we're also talking about rubbish and publication. What would be the final trash can to contain all trash cans, right? Or what would be the discourse to contain all discourse? It's impossible because you formalized it and you're using language. And so, what would be the language to contain all languages? We run into a deadlock, right? And this is what Lacan is getting at with discourse in the beginning of Seminar 14, only to build up the theory of psychoanalysis to show what it's getting at. And the fact that, well, Russell's paradox about the complete set, right? The Russell set, which would be uh, a set to contain all sets and the sets that do not contain themselves as a paradox. Well, it's a paradox only when we talk about it. It's not a paradox when we write about it, right? I could write it so far and so fine, and it's not a paradox. But it's only when I talk about it that my language and my sensibility and my understanding begin to deteriorate. And that's where paradoxical problems come about. And for Lacan, well, psychoanalysis isn't in the realm of sensibility. Um, I hope that made sense. Um, Again, this is the very first episode, and I feel like I'm giving you way more than I intended to, and it's just because there's just so much to look forward to, and he doesn't lay it all out right here. Um, we get to build up to it, but this is what is this is what he's getting at. It's not that, oh, okay, there's no universe of discourse, therefore we don't even need to be talking. Or like, he's not being nihilistic. What he's talking about is there is a sort of impasse that we have to recognize and that we have to account for, and that nobody has understood. And this is why he is actually critical of most philosophy, because they try to get at a fundamental ontology that would encapsulate everything, qua knowledge, right? Same thing with science. This is why he likes mathematics a lot, because mathematics is always changing their annotations whenever they run to an impasse, a contradiction, if you like that term better. But an impasse is very specific, I think. Anyhow, let us keep reading, shall we? There is a point in time at which I use pots as an example, but people made such a fuss about it that I decided to leave it out of my decree. A pot is a tangible image of a notion. It is, in some sense, a signification that is shaped by itself. Yeah, a pot, a cup, a box, a container, a set, right? It contains things. Pot may contain water, it may contain mustard seeds, who knows? The manifesting the appearance of a form and content, a pot makes us think that it is the content that is the signification, as if thought here manifests a need to imagine that thought must contain something, which the expression to contain oneself designates where it bears on an impetus act, or yeah, impetuous act. I called it a mustard pot in order to point out that far from necessarily containing any, it is precisely because it is empty that it takes on its value as a mustard pot. This is because the word mustard is written on it. But mustard, mutard, means that the pot is in a hurry to accede to the eternal life as a pot, which begins from the moment it has a hole in it. Indeed, it is in this form that we find it throughout the ages in archaeological digs. When we look in graves for something that can attest to the state of civilization, the pot has a hole in it. In homage, it is said to the dead and so on that the living cannot use it. That, of course, is one reason. But there is perhaps another, namely that the pot is designed to produce this hole. In order that the whole be produced, this is what is illustrated by the myth of the Danaids. It is with a hole in it that a pot, when we have retrieved it from its gravesite, stands proudly on the collector's shelf. In this moment of glory, its status is akin to God's. It is in the glory that it is revealed its precise nature. The structure of a pot, no, not its matter, appears here as what it is, namely the correlate of the functioning of a tube or drum. If we go looking for precursors for it in nature, as in horns and conch shells, we will see that their essence, namely their ability to produce sound, is still there after life, um, after life has been extracted from them. Whole civilizations are no longer represented to us by anything other than these little pots, which takes the form of a head or some animal covered in myriad signs that are impenetrable to us in the absence of a document connected to them. Here we sense that the signification of image is truly on the outside, and that what is on the inside is precisely what lies in the grave where we find it, namely precious materials and substances, perfumes, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, as they say. The pot explains the signification of what is there at the level of a use value, or rather, let us say, of an exchange value with another world and another dignitary, at the level of homage value. The fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in pots reminds us that it is not the signified that is inside, but rather the signifier. It is with the latter that we deal when it comes to what is important to us, namely the relationship between discourse and speech and psychoanalytic efficiency. So I think this is important right here. Well, one, I think if I'm not mistaken, this is a sort of call out, like which he's I think he's calling out Derrida in this moment because if I understand correctly, there has been a debate during this time regarding like a sign and structure between Derrida and Lacan. And I think it's around here, and I think it is also kind of even evoked again in Seminar 16. I know Daniel in our talks has mentioned this, and I don't know the full polemics around this, so forgive me. I'll do more research on this and find out and voice it in later regards. But regardless of that, I think it's important to rewind what we read earlier regarding the mustard pot and the Danaids, right? So he talks about, well, it's in a hurry to be a pot. um, we designate it as mustard pot because it has mustard written on it, but it also has a hole in there. Um, and so really, we don't know what the pot is due to its hole, but when it has something on there written on it, we get its sort of relayed meaning. Again, it's a signifier gets its meaning from other signifiers. Um, But again, with the structure is not complete. The structure is it has a whole. And he likens this to this myth of the Danaids, where it's like a group of women that murder their husbands, and their punishment by the gods is to fill up a big cauldron with water, and they all fill them this cauldron with pots of water, but there is a hole at the bottom of the cauldron, so it forever leaks, and so they're destined to repetitively pour water on it for the crime of killing their husbands. And so it's almost like a Sisyphean act, but I think this is a lot more instrumental of a myth to align with what structure is, namely a real whole. Um, and that there's this constantly repetition, an insistence of trying to insist its signification um, due to this lack, right? And this thing that he evokes about, uh, you know, pottery and the archaeology of digging up artifacts, and that, a pot with a hole, we don't know what it is, but thanks to things being put inside there, we find the Dead Sea Scroll. So we can relay this meaning to another meaning. Did this pot really exist from the same culture that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Who knows? But we could attribute it retroactively because we find something that builds some significance. And a signifier doesn't get its meaning from itself because it has no referent, right? It gets it from another signifier. So what is this whole? It's the subject, right? The subject has a whole. Subject has a mark. Therefore, it gets its meaning from another signifier. This is building up to something that he's going to talk about in a bit. And I'll just say it right now. Because if you've kept up with our seminar 3 stuff, or 1, 2, and 3, we've already talked about it. It's that the signifier is what represents the subject, barred S, the S dollar sign with a gap for another signifier or another set of signifiers, as we will see. So I think this is exactly what he's building up to right now. Having arrived at this point of offering what will serve you as an image of the unity of a theoretical function in the approach that is properly or improperly called structuralist, I will ask you to allow me a shortcut. I will call on Marx, who it was hard for me, bothered as I was about it for the long time, not to bring in sooner in a field where he certainly has his place, as Marx does regarding surplus value. I will indicate that the place where we find or we must situate the essential function of objet A. First, I will remind you what has been clearly brought out and not far from here. By recent studies, commentaries on Marx that were until this was denied by their author designated as structuralist. The author asks what the object of capital is. We will see what psychoanalysis allows us to correspondingly enunciate. Marx begins from the functioning of the market. What is new in his approach is how he situates labor. It is not that labor is new, it is that it is purchased. It is that there is a market for labor. This is what allows Marx to demonstrate what is inaugural in his discourse, surplus value. It is on this approach implies oh sorry, it in turn it turns out that this approach implies the revolutionary action with which you are all familiar, or rather, with which you are not very familiar. For it is not clear that the taking of power has resolved the subversion of the subject, of the capitalist subject, which has been expected to ensue from this action, or that it has, in fact, had bountiful consequences. Even in the eyes of the Marxists who who had to reap them. But for the time being, that is of little importance to us. What is important is what Marx designates and what his approach means. Whether commentators on Marx are structuralists or not, they seem to have demonstrated that Marx himself was a structuralist. For it is clear on the basis of what he was as a thinking being at the point of determined by the predominance of the labor market that the function, which admittedly obscures, given the confusion found in the commentaries of surplus value, proved to be the cause of his thought. The fact that this discourse is identical to its conditions will hopefully be clarified by what I will now say about the psychoanalytic approach. Just as labor was not new in the production of commodities, the renunciation of jouissance, whose relationship of labor I need not define any further, is far from new. Indeed, right from the outset, as opposed to what Hegel says or seems to say, it is the renunciation of jouissance that constitutes the master, who clearly intends to make it the motor force of his power. What is new in that there is a discourse that articulates this renunciation, and that brings it out in what I will call the function of surplus jouissance, or plus de jouir. That is the essence of psychoanalytic discourse. It is plus de jouir. We will get into that in a minute. Let us keep reading for now. The function appears owing to this very existence of discourse. It demonstrates that the renunciation of jouissance is an effect of the discourse itself. To delineate things, we must in fact assume that there is a market in the field of the other that totalizes merits and values. That assures the organization of choice. Um, sorry, ooh, I messed up. Uh, oh, sorry, I messed up. Let me read this again. Going back to this, we must in fact assume that there is a market in the field of the other that totalizes the merits and values. That assures that the organization of choices and preferences, and that implies an ordinal and even a cardinal structure. Discourse possesses the means of enjoying, insofar as it involves the subject. There would be no reason of subjects in the sense in which one says reason of state or raison d'être, right? Reason for being. If in the other's market there were not the following correlate, a surplus jouissance is established in the captured that is captured by a certain people. In order to demonstrate how surplus jouissance is related to the enunciation, how it is produced by discourse, and how it appears as an effect would no doubt require a detailed commentary. But it is not something that is all that new to your ears if you have read my work, for it is the topic of my paper, Con avec Sod, which is in the Accrete. I demonstrate that there is the total reduction of surplus jouissance to the act of applying to the subject in terms of the little a in fantasy, through which the subject can be posited as a self cause in desire. This year, I will elaborate on this point by returning to Pascal's wager, another important person that will be pivotal in this seminar. This year, I will elaborate on this point of returning to Pascal's wager, which provides an excellent illustration of the relationship between the renunciation of jouissance and wagering as a dimension. The whole of life is reduced therein to an element of the value, uh, element of a value. A strange way to inaugurate the market of jouissance in this field of discourse. Rightly so. So, really, what he's getting at is the fact that it seems like it's this discovery of labor, and not only that, but how it relates to surplus value for Marx, or as Lacan thinks in these commentaries on Marx. And Lacan wants to take a different approach because, of course, what he wants to talk about is surplus jouissance and how it relates to, the Marxist discourse. And he invokes Hegel. His reading of Hegel is, of course, from Kojève. And if you have read the introductory lectures to the phenomenology of spirit from Hegel by Alexander Kojève, he starts it off with the Lord and Bondsman as what builds civilization up. And the Lord and Bondsman has this element of desire, of lack, and can only be fed through the other or from the other. There is this negative element. The Lord and Bondsman is the struggle for prestige. There is a master, and he instantiates a law of enjoyment, a law of desire, for a lack of a better term. Now, I am not reading Kojève to you to the T in my exegesis. I am doing it in the words of Lacan. There is, in Lacan's reading of the Hegelian master slave dialectic, a master who imposes his desire, his enjoyment onto the slave. And this desire that the other imposes is a market, it is an economy. And the slave does the work for the master, produces the products of enjoyment, and the master extracts it from himself or for himself. This is what is going on. This is how a market of surplus jouissance is produced because what surplus jouissance is a whole. It is objet A, the cause of desire, and also its spoliation due to excess. It is entropy, things that do not work in the system and must be jettisoned out. In the same way that when the capitalist distributes its market onto the world, into an economy, and produces workers, people that sell their labor onto the market in exchange for the wage, produce products for the capitalist. The capitalist extracts that, it gives them the wage, but also in their work produces value and a surplus, which escapes that circuit and goes into the pockets of the capitalist. This surplus is also unknown to the capitalist, as well as this surplus is somewhat unknown to the master. So, what he's doing right now is giving us some gems, some crumbs to what he will talk about in his later seminar. He's just giving us the keys, right? As Khaled says, he's giving us the key. Each key leads to the next key, right? We're getting at the discourse of the master and how we have to understand that, it's like what Marx talks about. The he gets at the commodity first, only to then talk about its the original moment, the mythic moment of capitalism, of primitive accumulation. It's a violent moment. It's not the myth of, oh, just one person decided to save all his money and wealth because he realized that this shit would be valuable in the future. In a non-capitalist society, why would a capitalist or proto-capitalists think that, hey, I got all this money, I should save it up and then throw it into a market that did not exist during that time prior to capitalism? Uh, it is a violent and bloody struggle of subjugation through the means of, capital and all the things that it could invest in, all the things it expropriates, all the things and people it subjugates. In the same way, this is what the master in the Hegelian slave dialectic does to instantiate a society, a pact. And this is also synonymous to the killing of the primal father to instantiate the brotherhood, which would be civilization in Totem and Taboo, and a civilization where we need to renounce our enjoyment. We need to renounce our sexual libidinal desire. Society, which is predicated on the desire of the other, constitutes a loss, constitutes a whole. So as he says right here, where did I leave off of? Surplus jouissance is thus what allows us to isolate the function of objet A, right? Or did I read too far? Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. But this, but doesn't it follow easily from the function of goods allocated to the dead inscribed in history that we saw earlier? So Thus, this is not what is currently at issue. We are dealing with the theory insofar as it frees itself from the function of surplus jouissance. The production of an essential object is played out around surplus jouissance, an object whose function we must now define as objet A. And I already said, yeah, surplus jouissance is objet A. So we see how it shifts, right? Objet A used to be, at least I think in seminar six, something that is metonymic, um, a metonymic object in the level of the imaginary, and then it takes on uh, the function of anxiety, right, or the uncanny. As you'll say, like, for Freud, desire doesn't have an object. Well, he will say, no, it's desire, or sorry, anxiety is, anxiety has no object. Um, it's that anxiety is not without an object. And this um, object is objet A. It has something uncanny to the subject desire, but it can only see from the vantage point of the other, right? Um, think of the dream of Wolfman, right? He has seen objet A, something that's all too uncanny, using Freud's uncanny, from the vantage point of the gaze of the wolves. And then objet A takes on the cause of our desire in Seminar 11, which also has the prop of the gaze. Um, and it is also related to the traumatic real in Seminar 11. And then how it also plays in the logic of fantasy is that it is related to the subject's fantasy, so far as the subject is caught between this logins, right? Um, it could only formulate its desire or its fantasy through or little a and the S or whatever um formulate the other's desire in that. I'm just kind of losing my words now. So but now we see how this takes on a new form of surplus. It's not just jouissance, it is surplus jouissance. It's this excess. As Samuel McCormick says, it's not object A, it's abject A. It's an excess that does not work. Um, when you have an energy system, you're never going to have 100% energy that is produced being used. Um, some of it has a zero point 0.8 power factor, meaning that only 80% of that energy is used, and the 20% is just excess that gets lost, right? Because it just doesn't work. It would break down the energy machine. We're talking about energetics. And so, again, surplus jouissance is related to objet. It is objet, but it takes on a new function in here when we're talking about an economy or a market of the other, a market of the master. The crudeness of the echoes my introduction of this term has received and remains for me the guarantee that it has the efficacy I bestow on it. Recall Marx's famous passage in which, while developing his theory, he relishes in the opportunity to see surface the living incarnations of misrecognition. I have enunciated that the signifier is what represents the subject, uh, which represents the subject to another signifier. That is its definition. A definition must be correct in teaching, it must be rigorous. At a time when psychoanalysis is called upon to answer for something you should not believe I have any intention of eliding, which is the crisis of the relationship between the student and the university system. It is intolerable and unthinkable that people content themselves without saying that there is or that there are things about a field, un savoir, field of knowledge, that one can in no way define. If psychoanalysis cannot be enunciated as a field of knowledge and be taught as such, it has no business being where that is the only thing that counts. If the knowledge market is quite right now, again, we talked about markets. Now we're talking about a knowledge market. So let's keep that in mind. You go from a market instantiated by a master, right? Instantiates an enjoyment and also a surplus where there is a slave that loses, that renounces. Now we have a knowledge market. If the knowledge market is quite rightly shaken up by the fact that science brings it the unit of value or course credits, something that will allow it to sound the status of its exchange right down to its radical function. It is certainly not so that psychoanalysis can present itself by throwing in the towel when it can perfectly well articulate something about it. Every term that is employed on the topic, like non-conceptualization or the evocation um, of some sort of impossibility merely designates the ineptitude of those who promote it. The strategy with the truth, uh, which is the essence of therapeutics, undoubtedly cannot reside as such in any specific intervention, known as interpretation. In practice, all sorts of specific functions and variable lucky games can undoubtedly be opportune. Still, this is not a reason to misrecognize that they have no meaning unless they are situated at precise point at which it is clearly, or that it is the theory that gives them their weight. This is clearly what is at stake. Surplus jouissance arises from the renunciation of jouissance, owing to the effect of this discourse. It is what gives objet A its place, insofar as the market defines any object whatsoever or human labor as a commodity. This object bears within itself some element of surplus value. Surplus jouissance is thus what allows us to isolate the function of objet A. What do we in analysis, if not set in motion a discourse through the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis? What does the subject put in abeyance in this discourse? What does it suspend? His function as a subject. The subject is excused here from sustaining his discourse with a claim like, I am sane. It is one thing to speak and another to assert, I am saying what I just said. The subject of the statement says, I am saying. He says, I am asserting, just like I am doing here in my teaching. I am articulating the speech. It is not poetry. I am saying what is written here, and I could even repeat it, which is essential, varying it by adding that I wrote it. So one of the things that psychoanalysis does is that like it interrupts this sort of thing that, would not be put into abeyance in other discourses. What is put into abeyance is the subjects, what sustains the subject's, determination in, the cause of the discourse. The subject, you know, of this discourse um, is both the effect and its cause. And there's an sort of interruption that psychoanalysis sees by the fact that a subject says, I am sane. Well, if you're already talking, you don't need to state I am sane. Um, in a way, it reminds me of the liar's paradox where he says I am lying, right? Because I mean, I don't want to get too ahead, but part of what psychoanalysis does is just does not go without saying, and the truth speaks, right? It's not it's saying something true, like there isn't this content where it's like, oh, true, or true in this philosophical sense of like absolute truth or like, Platonic truth. No, but that there is something of the unconscious that is speaking, right? And it does it in these sort of moments right here. In analysis, the subject is excused from maintaining what he states. Will he thereby attain that purity of speech, that full speech, which I spoke about during my evangelizing phase, who was my so-called Rome's discourse, let's see, function and field of speech of language, addressed to, if not to those whose ears were most unwilling to hear it? I will not characterize what made those ears so impermeable, for it would be to pass judgment in a way that could only be offensive. So he's saying that, like, you know, So this thing about full and empty speech is something that appears first in his Rome's discourse, the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis, which would pave the way for seminar one. And empty speech and full speech so are the way that speech functions in psychoanalysis. Those that are free associating most of the time, if they're just talking about whatever, talking about themselves, talking about what they dislike, talking about just like what annoys them, talking about their day, it's like anybody else that vents and rants and rants and rants. It's idle chatter. It's empty speech. Why? Because it's empty of the signifier. It's empty of something that deteriorates and cuts through the subject's determination and alienation and imaginarized content. This is what he talked about as early on as seminar one and two. And when he talks about full speech, he brings up the case of Verneinung, linguistic crisscrossing, where something is affirmed in a negative way. Um, the classical example that Freud says in his negation paper is that woman in my dream, before I say anything, I can guarantee you was not my mother. There's an example, right? If it wasn't your mother, then why did you insist on having to say that that was not my mother when I had no way of implying that, right? And so this is what he's kind of evoking again, but also saying that like, people back then were not ready for my discourse. They were not ready to hear what I had to say. And it seems like things are still happening that way, but we will see, right? People were not ready for me to teach. People were not ready for me to speak about what psychoanalysis is. But consider the following when speaking of the Freudian thing, another paper, I just so happen to give free rein to something that I myself called the prosopopeia. It involves the truth stating the following. To you, I am thus the enigma of she who slips away as soon as she appears. You men who try so hard to hide me under the tawdry finery of your properties. Still, I admit your embarrassment is sincere. Recall that point uh, that I pointed out the function of the term embarrassment, quandary, embarrass on a separate occasion. For even when you take it upon yourselves to become my heralds, you acquire no greater worth by wearing my colors than your own colors, which are like you, phantoms, and that you are. Where am I going, having passed into you? And where was I prior to that? Will I perhaps tell you some day? But so that you will find me where I am, I will teach you by what sign you can recognize me. Men, listen. I am telling you the secret. I, truth, speak. I said it earlier. I forget that he mentions it in this part. I thought I was speaking ahead, but I guess I'm not. I did not write I am saying so if what speaks appeared the analysis would certainly be over. Close, as I ironically quote. But this is precisely what does not happen or what deserves to be punctuated differently when it does. Let let us return to the status of the subject who is called into question here. Through an artifice, he is asked in analysis not to be he who maintains what is proffered. One mustn't believe, however, that the latter disappears. For the psychoanalyst there is there to represent him. Yeah, sorry. I mean, in order to sustain him while he is unable to find anew his bearings as regards to the cause of his discourse. So the analyst is only a prop. He's not there to tell you anything. He's only there um, to be able just to be, yeah, uh, a prop for the cause of your desire. And so far that you have a hard time sustaining your discourse, especially, when you're in analysis in that function you become more cautious of your words when you realize that you're saying them in the act of free association, right? When somebody is there to relay that back to you, what you just said. This is why we must now turn to the fundamental formulation, specifically the one that defines the signifier as what represents the subject of another signifier. I'm surprised that no one has yet observed that its corollary is that a signifier cannot represent itself to itself, what I've been saying throughout this entire exegesis. Naturally, this is not new either, for it is implied by what I have articulated regarding repetition. See Seminar 11, classes 2 to 5. But we must pause here for a moment in order to see it in action. What can the itself of the signifier mean in the sentence? Note that when I talk about the signifier, I am talking about something opaque. When I say that we must define the signifier as what represents the subject to another signifier, I mean that no one will know anything about it except the other signifier. And the other signifier is headless, since it is a signifier. Here, the subject is stifled in a face at the very moment he appears. How can some facet of this subject, who disappears as soon as he emerges, produced by a signifier in order to immediately fade, in another be constituted and ultimately manage to get itself viewed by self-consciousness or self-awareness? In other words, as something that is content to be identical to itself. This is what we must now consider. In whatever form the subject arises in the presence, he cannot reunite with the signifying representative without a loss occurring in the identity that is known, strictly speaking, as objet A. This is what Freud's theory says about repetition, which means that regarding recourse to jouissance, in which, owing to the sign, something else comes to occupy its place, namely the trait that marks it. Nothing is identifiable. Nothing can arise here without an object being lost. A subject is what may be represented by another signifier, or represented by a signifier to another signifier. Isn't this modeled on the fact that in Marx, the decipher, namely the economic reality, the subject of exchange value is represented with respect to use value? Question mark. It is in the gap, the slippage, the file between the exchange value and use value that what is known as surplus value arises and falls away. The only thing of importance to us here is this loss, no longer identical to himself. The subject no longer something, uh, enjoys. Something is lost that is known as surplus jouissance. It is strictly correlate with the come into play of what hence determines everything about thought. It is no different when it comes to symptoms. What is at stake in the symptom is not the greater or the lesser, uh, with each sh- slipping up. What is at stake in symptoms if not the greater or lesser ease with which the subject revolves around something that we call surplus jouissance, but that he is quite incapable of naming unless he goes around it. He cannot proceed to do anything involving not only his relationship with his fellow men, but even his most profound relationship, the one with life itself. Economic references, and configurations are all the more serendipitous than those Freud had at his disposal from the realm of thermodynamics, which were more remote in this case, although not entirely unsuitable. This is the element that can allow us to make headway in the analytic discourse. In the definition of the subject as caused by the relationship between signifiers, we have a theoretically posited or posited a priori, and without any need for a long recursion in order to constitute its premises, something that prohibits us from ever grasping him. This is also the occasion to perceive what gives the subject the unity. Let us provisionally call it preconscious, not unconscious, that has heretofore allowed us to consider him to supposedly have everything he needs, or supposedly suffice unto himself, supposedly be self contained. Far from being the case, it is around this formula of fundamental fantasy. Here we go. Fundamental fantasy. That is around the being of A, of surplus jouissance, that a relationship is constituted, that up to a certain point allows us to see a soldering occur, that precipitates that precipitation or congealing, which is such that we can unify a subject as the subject of an entire discourse. I will put it on the board. What is involved here? The first formula indicates that a signifier, an S1, as we see right here, right, represents the subject, which is a barred S, the dollar sign, who can never be eluded, who can never but elude himself, um, or never be able to grab hold of himself to another signifier, which is S2. So if you could see this on the screen, which I have shared, we have right here a three-legged animal. We have a signifier, which represents a subject, barred S, who cannot ever grasp himself, which he eludes himself, to another signifier, S2. And he says this right here. The second formula indicates that any signifier in the chain, in this case S2, can be correlated to something that is still merely an object, little a, which is created or manufactured in the relationship of surplus jouissance. So it seems like right here, so like he puts this little S3 and lozenge with the A. This is a sort of mathem to kind of illustrate what is happening in the process of, the barred subject being represented by S1 relating itself to another signifier. So as soon as it relates to S2, a chain of signifiers, it is already losing itself. It's representative to a field of signifiers. And thus, we get this constant repetition, this inversion, if you like. I use the term inversion. I'd hate to use it, but it's the only thing that comes to mind. But more of like a chain where the subject loses itself trying to represent itself via the signifier. And it loses itself because it has a mark, this mark of loss, right? That happens when it becomes a subject. We mentioned castration in the beginning when we started the text. This mark of castration, this mark of loss, is none other than the unary trait. This is what constitutes repetition. And the subject, its mark, the unary trait, is thus represented by a signifier, S1. And it's not just one mark. It's not one as in a unity, as an indivisible monad. It's one as an operation of a count as one, a count of a one by one by one by one. And then these little members of marks get constituted and represented by a signifier. This mark of castration, this mark of loss, brings forth objet A, the surplus jouissance of a repetition trying to represent itself to another signifier, a chain of signifiers, which is S2. If that doesn't make sense, what this unary trait is, we will talk about that more. To give you some, you know, Red Lobster cheddar biscuit appetizers, think of the moment in Beyond the Pleasure Principle when Freud talks about Fort Da, his grandson, who is given to him and told to look after him while his mother goes away for a bit. This is the mark of absence, of separation. And in that absence, something is marked, something is then happening in this originary moment where this scene is repeated through different phonemes, different sounds from the baby. And then symbolically constituted by a repetition of a presence and absence, of tossing the toy and refining the toy, only to repeat it again. Fort Da. By entering into the workings of the organism, the object is able to take the shape of those vanishing entities whose list I have already provided, uh, which runs the gamut of from the breast to the feces and from the voice to the gaze. So these are the partial objects of the partial drives. Um, these are all created by discourse concerning the renunciation of jouissance. The mainspring of this creation is, in fact, that surplus jouissance can be produced around them. As I've already told you regarding Pascal's wager, even if we were only one single life beyond death that could win by wagering, we could have, uh, we would have to work enough in this life to know how to conduct ourselves in the next. The mainspring of this work, like the exchange to which the wager proceeds with something we would like to know is worthwhile, is a functioning which is correlated with the surplus jouissance and which is that of the market. It is at the very basis of this idea Pascal explored, with the extraordinary blindness, it seems, of someone who lived at a time when the market function first began to skyrocket. Although he inaugurated scientific discourse, let us not forget that he also, even at his most extreme moments of his retreat and his conversion, wanted to found a company of Parisian omnibuses. Pascal knew not what he was saying when he spoke of the happy life. Again, Pascal will be important, but we will see its incarnation here. But what else can be grasped in the term happy if not the very function that is incarnated in surplus jouissance? Question mark. We thus have no need to wager about the next life to know what is worth. Worth where surplus jouissance shows itself nakedly. This is this has a name, perversion. And this is why holy women have perverted sons. There is no need for the next life for the transmission of an essential play of discourse to occur between such a man and her son. The following schema allows us to conceptualize how what is involved in the production of little a plays out in fantasy. So we have this thing right here, and this production of the same formula of fantasy through this lozenge. A, which constitutes the cause of desire in the subject, and its reduplication as fantasy. The reiteration of the signifier that represents the subject, barred S, in relation to himself, is correlated with fantasy, which is placed below the bar here. Inversely, the relationship between the subject and the object thereby takes on its own consistency in S and A, or the formula of fantasy, which is barred S, lozenge, this little diamond, and little a, in which something arises which is no longer either subject or object, which is known as fantasy. The other signifiers forming a chain linking up and thereby congealing in the effect of signification can introduce metonymy or metonymy as an effect that solders the subject together. I think what he's getting at here in this metonymy of significations, because we were talking about the way metaphor and metonymy operate with the signifier. Metonymy, I believe, are these sets of demands that then form and constitute desire later, um, with Lacan metaphor and the Oedipus complex. For example, oh, and again, we talk about this in seminar 3 for an introduction of metaphor and metonymy. I will link that below as well. I'll just link the entire series. For example, in the sentence, a child is being beaten, someone is beating a child, whether the subject is situated in the moment of a child, of being beaten, or of someone, on the subject becoming something equivalent and unified, being to which we are inclined, to give an all-purpose image in discourse, as if there could be a subject of all signifiers. If owing to the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, something can be sufficiently loosened up in the chain so that the revelatory effects occur, how can we characterize this fact so as to give it a full import? Question mark. In order to provide an image for the appearance of truth in analytic experience, I characterize it with a mythical I am speaking or I speak. It is an ideal one, no doubt, but we must now understand that the truth is thus brought out. The truth, the truth thus brought out is taken shape and suspended between the two registers that I am adumbrating as limits in the title of my seminar this year, the other and little a. So the other as in big other and the little a. So what is the other capital O? It is the field of truth that I defined as the locus in which the subject's discourse takes on consistency, and it and in it which it is proffered in order to offer itself up to be refuted or not. The problem arose for Descartes to know whether there is or is not a God who guarantees this field. Today, this problem has totally evaporated, owing to the fact that there is no possibility of a totality or a totally consistent discourse in the field of the other. Please excuse me for not having time to demonstrate it today. Let it suffice for me to indicate that it is demonstrable. I hope to explain it to you next time, especially as related to the subject's existence. It is a demonstration that I have already once very quickly wrote on the board. It is easily found in the first chapter of any book on what is known as set theory. Yet it will be necessary, at least for some of you here, to demonstrate in what way it is relevant. In the elucidation of the function of the discourse as analysts, to present a function that is extracted from a logic that one would be mistaken to believe that to call it mathematical is to exclude it and consign it to the next classroom over. If consistency of what is known as truth cannot be assured anywhere in the other where there is truth, if not in what little a's function assures, question mark. On another occasion, I thus already laid out the status of truth's cry. I, or so in quotes, I, the truth, end of quotes, I wrote, quote, speak, end of quote, or I am speaking. And I do so purely to embarrass you. This is what truth can say to move us. But this is not what someone suffering cries out, because he is that truth. The latter must know that his cry is but a silent cry, a cry in a vacuum, a cry that I once illustrated using Munch's famous engraving, the scream. So you probably know it's the one that goes like this. It looks like the little scream face, and like he's screaming, and everything looks all absurd. And you see people on the bridge, um, walking by, and nobody can hear his scream but himself. What is the other, or what in the other can respond to the subject at this level? Nothing other than what constitutes his consistency and his naive faith in what he is as an ego, namely his truth stay, or namely his true stay, his creation, his fabrication as objet A. The only thing across from the subject is one extra among so many others who can in no way answer truth's cry, if not to say that it is quite precisely its equivalent, non-jouissance, misery, distress, and solitude. Such is A's counterpart, the counterpart of surplus jouissance that constitutes the subject's coherence qua ego. There is nothing to add, unless I wish to leave you today on a lighter note. And in order to do so, I mention the words of an old king from Ecclesiastes, a king who saw no contradiction between being the king of wisdom and having a harem. All is undoubtedly vanity, he tells us. So, enjoy the woman you love. In other words, make a ring of the hollow or emptiness that is at the center of your being. There is no neighbor if it is not the very hollow that is in you, your own emptiness. This relationship is assertedly guaranteed solely by the figure that undoubtedly allows Freud to make his way down the perilous path, enabling us to clarify relations that could not have otherwise been bearable without this myth, divine law, that leaves the jouissance between man and woman in his entirely primitive state. We must say the following: give her what you do not have, because the only thing that can unite you with her is her jouissance. It is on this note a simple, total religious enigma akin to what is broached only in Kabbalah. That I will release you today. Literally certify account books today. So that was in November 13th of 1968. So this intro is actually right before, um, oh no, sorry. This was the intro at May 68, or so after the height of the May 68 thing, not before. Sorry. But I mean, there was a lot there. And I mean, when you really think about what is going on, we are dealing with the problem of the other and how this relates to the subject. The subject really is constituted by the big other, and yet its lack, the subject's lack, is thus formulated by an object cause of desire. And this thing thus constitutes the ego. And as he had mentioned in seminar 1 and 2, that the ego is an other. It's an alien, imaginary other. If you like your term alienation, that's what it is, but it is from an other, right? And we really get to see how the relationship of little o other to big O other operates, and it's through the subject and objet a. And yet there's an inconsistency and hole in the big other. And didn't Pascal realized this in the rise of scientific discourse in its inauguration, the end of superstition, the end of the religious worldview, the rise of secular society, and the absolutization of the market, according to Lacan. But he still wishes to insist upon the existence of God, versus Descartes, who believes that there is an other demon deceiving him, and yet his cogito is only to prove his existence and also God's existence, who is the guarantor of the field of truth. God is the other for Descartes. Not only that, Descartes, who inaugurates the cogito, inaugurates the subject of science. The subject of science, of course, is the split subject that is resuscitated in psychoanalysis. Again, a lot has been laid out, a lot to be wagered. But this was only the intro. We haven't even gotten to the actual seminar yet. And when we get to the actual seminar portion, things will start to punctuate all these things that have been laid out. Surplus value and surplus jouissance as objet a, the subject who cannot represent itself, but needs a signifier to represent itself for another signifier, and how the other signifier, S2, represents the field of knowledge, which is the other, right? And yet this other has an inconsistency and can only be realized through the process of psychoanalysis and analytic discourse itself. Now, I hope you enjoy that. I know I kind of stumbled a bit. This was the very first one. I didn't expect it to go extremely well. I didn't expect it to go very terribly. I just expect it to just happen. The subject insisting upon its discourse. So stay tuned for more. And it won't always be in this format. Sometimes it'll just be me here right now talking. without sharing my screen with the text. Sometimes I will share my whiteboard doing diagrams and talking. And not to mention, we will be having guest lectures as well, elaborate the details on the seminar. So thank you all. Please enjoy your symptom and come back for more. Have a good night.